Hello and welcome to my review of Whipping Star by Frank Herbert, author of Dune. And that epithet is significant not just in the light of the recent film version, but also in the way that one novel or a series can loom over a writer's entire legacy. How many people can name more than one song by Vanilla Ice, for example? Perhaps a fairer comparison with the world of music would be with somebody like Meatloaf, whose one classic album overshadows the rest of his oeuvre to the extent that each decade or so we get another sequel to The Battle of Hell. Herbert was slightly more prolific, but there's no doubt that all of his most famous works have the word Dune in the title. This novel, following on from a short story that was called The Tactful Saboteur, began a shorter and more loosely connected series featuring the protagonist Jorg X McKie. A few years removed from a government that was so efficient that it legislated laws so rapidly it was impossible to predict the outcomes of them, the Bureau of Sabotage was founded to rather put sand in the works of a hasty but unintended tyranny. Jorg X McKie is a saboteur extraordinary, responsible for keeping things running in a more orderly but less efficient manner. McKie is called in when a Caliban beach ball washes up on a beach, surprisingly enough. Calibans are the species that provided instant cross-galaxy travel using their jump doors, but they've been disappearing from the galaxy, and each time one of them disappears there's a waves of deaths and insanity connected. So this rare appearance requires investigation, and when he arrives he meets a Caliban called Fannie Mae. Fannie Mae has entered into a contract with a vastly wealthy human who is a pervert and enjoys flogging, but in order to cure her of her kink has had personality surgery which makes her greatly disturbed at witnessing the suffering of others. The Caliban has no concept of pain, so can be seemingly flogged at will. In conversation with Fannie Mae, though, McKie learns that she will in fact die if the whipping continues, a minor problem when linked to the likelihood of insanity and death that accompanies a typical Caliban's demise. However, Fannie Mae explains that she's also the source of the jump gates, and her death will cause the death of everyone that has ever used one, which is, in fact, everybody, bar a few newborns and infants. Abneth, who is the rich human, the pervert, and her crew know this, but they expect to be able to ride out the apocalypse in a different wave of reality. McKie attempts to stop the whipping through legal means, but without great success, because Abneth has been replaced by a more decisive and uncaring alien called Chio. McKie needs to find a way to stop them before it's too late. Now, I have to say that this is one of those videos that I really just don't want to make, because the people that find this review through random chance on YouTube will likely be fans of this book, or people that read it as a child and get some kind of nostalgia buzz when it's mentioned. And I can understand that to a certain extent, because the myriad of weird and wonderful aliens, all with their own oddities that are briefly explored, and its zany premise, it might make you feel like this was some sort of wild romp. In the hands of Harry Harrison, it may even have been one. And with character names like Jorg X McKie and an alien called Fannie Mae, this does sound like it can only be a space opera from the 1950s, or a spoof of such, right? Well, what if I told you that they're aliens called Tapricius who bend space in order for cross-galaxy phone calls to take place instantly, and when they talk they say "Pacha, Pacha, Pacha." But putting that aside briefly, this is how they're described. Tapriciates came in odd shapes like sawed-off lengths of burnt conifers, with stub limbs jutting every which way, needle-like speech appendages, fluttering even when they remained silent. This one's skid feet beat a nervous rhythm on the surface where it stood. Along with the skid feet, when the phone call goes through, the recipient enters a state called a snigger trance. So it's a spoof, right? Well, not that I could detect, nor does the novel date from the 1950s. It first appeared in the pages of Worlds of If in 1969, getting a reworking prior to this edition, which dates from 1972, which is at least, if you go from the 1969 date, 4 years after the Dune series began. And it's hard to believe that the same author that gave us Harkonnens and Atreides also gave us Tapriciates, the Snigger Trance, and Chair Dogs. Though the last one is a cheat because it's actually in both series, perhaps making them both part of the same canon. The plot here is not really worthy of the name. A pervert wants to end the universe, even though it seems to have been rather kind to her, furnishing her with enough wealth to own several planets and enough power to frighten off most of the government's departments. Given that her kink is common knowledge in the universe, I'm unsure of why she would feel the need to be cured of it. Additionally, the Bureau's job is to interfere with the government. But when the agreement between Fannie Mae and Abneth threatens the existence of everyone, surely that would become under the auspices of a different government agency, something with the job of looking after the universe. The Bureau of Sabotage's involvement, if any, would be limited to interfering with the space FBI if they were investigating the contract too efficiently. McKie might be the universe's top saboteur, but this job does not require a saboteur. If anything, it needs a communication specialist, which McKie does seem to be, though again, how that ties in with sabotage is anybody's guess. Regardless, McKie adopts a rather shotgun approach to solving the problem, throwing orders around that are designed to interfere and annoy Abneth into revealing her location. Perhaps he too is not allowed to be efficient. But we never see the outcome or the effects of any of the orders that he gives, because the story is mostly limited to conversation between McKie and Fannie Mae, where the common theme of discussion is how hard it is to communicate cross species. Fannie Mae's perception of the universe is clearly very different to McKie's, as is her view of time with her struggles with English verb tenses or anything to go by, but they are far from her only struggle with communication. Understand, the Caliban said, life which flows in all carries subternal connectives. Each entity remains linked until final discontinuity removes from network. Yes, suitable term, network. Unaware of tanglements, I convey linkages of other entities into association with Abneth. Should personal discontinuity overtake self, all entities entangled share it. Discontinuity, McKie asked, not sure if he followed, but afraid he did. Now this is one of the rare occasions where Fannie Mae is actually both concise and clear by her standards. Everybody is connected through the Caliban, and when the connection ends, everybody's going to die. And McKie says he follows, but the two of them still continue to repeat this for another page or two, which is fairly typical of the style of the novel. So typical, in fact, that when in a later exchange McKie begins with, what the other sentients in the room don't realise, it's fairly obvious that he's actually referring directly to the reader. But the Caliban speech is contagious. The scientist Tuluk catches it after sharing a prescient phone call with Fannie Mae. It can only follow that the point contacts of our problem have their separate existence within different frameworks of time. Ergo, Abneth occupies another dimension time from that of the beach ball. Inescapable conclusion. If the novel is a discussion of communication problems, then perhaps the last thing, but also the next thing that it requires, is another spouter of word vomit. Page numbers on your screen are pages in which somebody refers to somebody else's communication as gibberish, and they continue, as you can see, right to the very end. Apparently gibberish is an astonishingly cross-species word, because all the different races know it and understand it, and they all use it quite accurately, somewhat undermining the issue of cross-cultural communication that is one of the main themes of the novel. And the most interesting thing about the novel is how Heinleinian it is, with how spacesuit will travel treading the same ground 10 years earlier. There's also echoes of Mike from the Moon as a harsh mistress, the adoption and misuse of modern slang, and the very frequent you hang, as in you have the hang of this, is so very reminiscent of you grok. The Heinleinian extends as far as McKie, elite even among the Bureau. He's the relentlessly competent man badgering his superiors and inferiors into seeing and doing things his way. He's one of the more tolerable parts of the novel, but the debt remains unpaid to the Heinlein estate, even though this book is dedicated to Lurton Bassingame, who's Heinlein's agent, perhaps Herbert's too. But with the jump doors themselves functioning as a murder weapon, movable and resizable, McKie requires a team of bodyguards. However, there is literally no protection from opening a door beneath him and closing it up again as he's falling through it. They try the reverse, hooking him upwards through a jump door above his head, but don't try the inverse. Because for all the strange and magnificently odd aliens that proliferate the novel, Herbert didn't include anything much that made any sense. Even the editor seems to have given up halfway through, where the number of typing errors increases quite dramatically. The final revelation of Fannie Mae's identity raises a regular theme of Herbert's in its inseparable ties between ecology and fauna, between gods and how they are identified, created, or even overthrown, and the consequences of doing such a thing. But such things are explored far more entertainingly in Dune. In Willis McNeely's biography of Herbert, he writes, "It is impossible to consider any of his later writing without making comparison to his masterwork. And with Whipping Star, it is impossible to do so without that comparison being extremely unfavourable. Even the more interesting themes we just touched on are the themes of Dune." In conclusion, describing Whipping Star's plot in a way that doesn't make it sound like a spoof is actually quite difficult unless you consider the bouts of insanity and death. However, reading the execution of that plot is an incredibly laborious process. Long tracks of overblown, repetitive, or indecipherable dialogue make this a slog. The jokes are more difficult to spot than a side-on two-dimensional jump door. Bleeler says that Herbert's action scenes are some of the best in science fiction, but there is nothing of the kind in Whipping Star. Even perverts hoping to read about Abner's kinks are shortchanged, as the closest the novel gets to anything sexual is Fannie Mae claiming to love McKie. But with her identity revealed in the finale, that love would be platonic and not exclusive. Whipping Star sounds like a comedy, but if you've read it, I suspect you know that the joke is on you. I was very interested to explore Herbert's work beyond the boundaries of Dune, and there are some interesting themes here, but one Herbert explores better in his other work. There are some nice touches to the designs of the aliens, but overall Whipping Star is desperately uninteresting and impossible to recommend. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.